The first hints of dawn painted the sky behind the mountains when Aang finally realized he'd been staring at the same crack in the stone floor for several minutes. The shrine of the Avatar was still half in shadow, the great circular window at its back only just beginning to glow with pale blue light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, turning in slow spirals as if the room itself were breathing. 4 statues loomed over him from each side of the chamber: an air nomad with his staff, a stern water tribe woman, a robed Earth Kingdom sage, and a proud Fire Nation warrior, all former avatars, all carved from the same cold stone. Their eyes seemed to follow him. Aang sat cross-legged on the floor, his small frame dwarfed by the vastness of the shrine. His quarterstaff lay across his lap, clutched so tightly in his hands that his fingers ached. He didn't loosen his grip. The smooth wood had always been a comfort, something that made him feel like himself. Now it felt like a reminder. "You are the bridge between worlds now." Gyatso's words echoed through his mind again, softer than the howl of the wind outside, but somehow heavier than the mountains themselves. A title that didn't fit, a responsibility that felt like wearing robes 4 sizes too big and being told not to trip. Bridge between worlds, Avatar, chosen. 12. Aang's heart hammered in his chest. His ribs seemed too small to hold it. He glanced up at the statues again. Their stone faces were calm, wise, unbothered. None of them looked like they'd ever been 12. None of them looked like they had ever wanted to run back to the dormitory and hide under a blanket. A gust of wind slipped through the open doorway with a mischievous whistle, rustling his robes and carrying in the scent of pine and cold air. Cherry blossom petals, shaken loose from the inner courtyard, tumbled across the floor in pink-white streams. They skated past his knees, piling gently at the base of the nearest Avatar statue. Outside, somewhere beyond the temple, morning birds were just beginning to sing. Aang swallowed hard. The sound felt far away. "What if I mess everything up?" he thought. "What if I can't do it? What if the world is counting on me and I just can't?" The question didn't have words at first. It was more like a pressure building behind his sternum, a knot twisting slowly tighter. But when his mind finally gave it shape, it rang louder than any temple drum. From the shadows near the doorway, another soft sound broke through the anxious silence, the quiet scrape of sandals on stone. "Aang," Monk Gyatso's voice, gentle and familiar, rolled into the room like warm air. Aang didn't need to look to know it was him, but he did anyway. The old monk stepped into the shaft of dawn light, his orange and yellow robes catching the soft glow. Years of laughter had etched lines around his eyes, but this morning they were tinged with something heavier. Worry, love. Both. Gyatso walked over without hurry, the way he always did, as if time itself waited politely for him to finish whatever he was doing. He lowered himself beside Aang with the soft groan of old joints and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You'll wear the floor smooth if you keep staring that hard," he said. Aang gave a weak smile that flickered and died. "Sorry." "You don't have to apologize for thinking," Gyatso replied. "If we punished thinking, every airbender would have been banished centuries ago." A breath of amusement pushed out of Aang despite himself. Gyatso's presence was like a blanket around his shoulders. "Master," Aang said quietly, eyes drifting back to the statues, What if they made a mistake?" Gyatso followed his gaze. The carved faces of past avatars stared back, lit in a soft halo by the rising sun. In the distance, out past the open archways, The silhouette of the giant lion turtle statue stood noble and still, as if guarding the temple. "Mistake?" Gyatso repeated. "I don't think I've ever heard the universe described as clumsy." "I mean," Aang's fingers tightened around the staff. "I'm just me. I like air scooter races and pie-stealing competitions and gliding off rooftops when you're not looking. I fall asleep in meditation sometimes. I still mix up the third form of the east wind with the second form of the north whirl." He turned to Gyatso, eyes wide and pleading. "How am I supposed to carry 4 whole nations when I can't even remember all the stances?" Gyatso considered him for a moment. The sunrise crept higher, tracing a curve of gold along the shrine floor. The petals rustled softly. "Every avatar felt fear when the duty fell to them, Aang," he said at last. "Do you think Avatar Yangchen came out of the cradle knowing how to soothe spirits and negotiate peace treaties? Or that Avatar Karuk knew how to face monsters from the spirit world without his hands shaking?" "They didn't?" Aang asked. "Of course not," Gyatso said. "Yangchen was terrified of disappointing her people. Karuk thought it was all a mistake. Roku," he smiled faintly, "Roku managed to set his master's beard on fire his first week of training. Ask him about that someday." Aang blinked. The idea of the legendary Avatar Roku accidentally setting his master's beard on fire was so absurd that a tiny bubble of laughter rose in his chest. "You're making that up," he said weakly. Gyatso raised a hand. "On my honor as a monk, I am not. I was there." He paused. "Well, not there, but I heard it from someone who heard it from someone whose eyebrows never fully grew back. The point is, they all started where you are now, small, scared, and absolutely certain they weren't ready." Aang looked down at his hands. They didn't look like hands that could change the world. They just looked like hands that sometimes dropped their staff during practice. "What if I'm never ready?" he whispered. Gyatso's fingers squeezed his shoulder gently. When he spoke this time, his voice lost its teasing lilt and settled into something solid and steady. "Then we will keep walking until you are," he said. "The weight is not yours to carry alone. Your past lives stand behind you. Your friends will stand beside you. I will stand in front of you when I can. That is how we carry it." Aang's eyes stung. "But what if I run away?" he asked, the fear he'd barely dared to think slipping out. "What if it's too much?" Gyatso was quiet for a long time. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke fully over the mountain peaks, spilling into the shrine. The stained glass inlays along the wall ignited in color, blues, greens, reds, and golds painting shifting patterns across the floor like molten jewels. "If you run," Gyatso said finally, "the fear will chase you. Pain will find you anyway. That's what pain does." He turned Aang gently so the boy faced him. "But if you face it, if you train, learn, and grow, then one day you will be stronger than you can possibly imagine. Strong enough not just to protect yourself, but to protect others. Strong enough to choose peace when everyone else chooses war." Aang swallowed. The words settled in his chest, heavy but not crushing, like a cloak set on his shoulders instead of chains wrapped around his neck. He breathed in. The air tasted like incense, cold stone, and the faint sweetness of blossoms. "I'll try," he said softly. "That," Gyatso replied, "is all any avatar has ever promised." For the first time that morning, Aang's heartbeat began to slow. He didn't feel ready, not even close. But a tiny part of him, small and fragile, like a new leaf, believed that maybe he could be. "Come," Gyatso said, standing with a soft groan and offering a hand. The world will not save itself on an empty stomach. And if I know the kitchen staff, they've already given your share of the rice cakes to the lemurs. Aang gasped. They wouldn't! Gyatso's eyes twinkled. You ran off at dawn without eating. What did you expect? Aang scrambled to his feet. We have to hurry! They left the shrine together. As they stepped into the open hallway, the full light of morning spilled over them. The Southern Air Temple, perched on its mountain, stretched out in a lacework of bridges, towers, and courtyards. Prayer flags fluttered in the wind, rattling softly against their poles. Bells chimed in the distance as monks began their routines. It all looked the same as it always had, only Aang felt different. They walked past a group of younger acolytes who were sweeping the courtyard. One of the boys stopped mid-sweep, eyes wide as he looked at Aang. Is it true? He blurted. Are you really? Back to work, Tashi, Gyatso said mildly. The boy blushed, ducking his head and scrubbing furiously at an invisible patch of dust. Still, his eyes flicked upward at Aang again, full of awe and a little envy. Avatar, those eyes said. Just Aang, his own thoughts replied, stomach fluttering. In the dining hall, long wooden tables were already half full. Monks and acolytes chatted softly over bowls of porridge and tea as sunlight poured in through archways. The smell of warm rice, roasted nuts, and dried fruit filled the air. Aang snagged a tray and joined the line. A few heads turned as he passed. Whispers, glances, hurried bows that made him want to shrink into his robes. Gyatso only smiled and proceeded as though nothing had changed. Extra fruit for the Avatar, the kitchen monk said solemnly as he ladled a generous scoop into Aang's bowl. Aang's face went crimson. You don't have to. Nonsense, the monk said. If the world is riding on your shoulders, it should at least be well fed. Aang caught Gyatso fighting back a grin. He sat near the open window, where the view of the valley helped him breathe. The river far below glinted like a silver thread. Clouds moved lazily beneath the mountain, making it feel as if the temple floated above the world. So, Gyatso said around a sip of tea, today, we begin your training as the Avatar in earnest. Aang nearly choked on a mouthful of porridge. In earnest? What have we been doing all these years? Teaching you not to fall off the temple, Gyatso said. A foundational skill, in my experience. Today we build on that. Aang stared into his bowl, suddenly less hungry. What does earnest training look like? Gyatso set his cup down. More meditation, more advanced airbending forms, lessons in history, philosophy, and diplomacy. You'll learn about the other nations, their cultures, their strengths and wounds. You must know what you are meant to protect. Aang slumped. That sounds like a lot of sitting. It is, Gyatso agreed cheerfully. But I have found ways to make even sitting dangerous. That doesn't make me feel better, Aang muttered. Gyatso chuckled. You'll be fine, little lion. Aang looked up. Why do you keep calling me that? Gyatso's gaze drifted toward the distant lion turtle statue carved into the mountainside. Because lions look small when they are cubs. Soft, playful. His eyes returned to Aang, but inside them is something ancient and powerful. They do not know it yet, but the world does. A shiver traced Aang's spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. After breakfast, the temple's routine shifted around him. While other acolytes went to their usual lessons, Aang followed Gyatso to the main training courtyard, where the wind made the prayer flags dance, and the cliffs dropped away into endless mist. The stone floor was marked with circles and lines from centuries of practice. Carved dragon heads peered down from the high walls, mouths open in permanent roars. "Begin," Gyatso said simply. Aang set his staff aside and stepped into the center circle. His bare feet found the familiar position of the first form, but everything felt different now, like performing an old dance with a new weight tied to his ankles. He drew in a breath. The air came willingly. It always had. It filled his lungs, pressed gently against his skin, slid around his wrists and ankles like invisible silk. He let it out in a controlled exhale, sweeping his arm in a curve. The wind followed his motion in a smooth arc, tugging at the edges of Gyatso's robes. "Good," Gyatso said. "Again, faster." They moved through the forms. Aang's body remembered what his mind tried to worry about. He leaped and spun, palms slicing through the air, each movement shaped invisible currents, gusts, spirals, and gentle cushions. He rode a small airball 3 steps before stumbling off, then laughed and tried again. "Focus," Gyatso reminded, though there was fondness in his tone. They progressed to more advanced techniques. Gyatso had him practice the twisted updraft, a vertical spiral of wind that could both shield and launch. The first attempt sent Aang skidding backward on his rear. "Ow! Your center is too high," Gyatso said, demonstrating. He dropped into a low stance, hands turning in opposing circles. A column of air wrapped around him, humming softly like a living thing. "Lower your weight. Feel the air move through you, not just around you." Aang tried again. This time, the swirling air wrapped more evenly around his body. He rose a few inches off the ground, hovering in the column, heart thudding with exhilaration. He wobbled, waved his arms wildly, then burst out laughing as the wind gently let him down. "That's it," Gyatso said. "Now spin." By midday, Aang's robe was plastered to his skin with sweat. His muscles burned and his legs trembled each time he landed. They practiced tornadoes, tiny ones at first, swirling leaves and pebbles around his ankles, then gliding twirls that carried him from one end of the courtyard to the other in smooth, circular arcs. Once, he misjudged a landing and slammed shoulder first into a pile of straw training dummies. He lay there for a moment, stunned, staring up at the perfectly blue sky framed by circling stone dragons. Then, slowly, he started to laugh. The sound echoed off the courtyard walls, bright and clear and utterly alive. Gyatso shook his head, smiling. "If you can still laugh, you can still train." They broke only briefly for water and a handful of dried fruit. Aang's chest rose and fell like bellows, but he was more relaxed than he had been in days. When he moved, when he bent, the world narrowed to air and motion and the next stance. There wasn't room for fear there. By late afternoon, they stood facing a stone avatar dummy at the edge of the courtyard. It was carved in the shape of a generic warrior, its surface pocked and scarred from previous training sessions. "Remember," Gyatso said, "the goal is not to destroy your opponent. It is to control the field, to redirect their force, to protect others. Show me." Aang nodded. He stepped forward, feet sliding into position. He felt the wind gather at his back, eager. The dummy didn't move, but in his mind, it did. It was an enemy soldier, then a spirit beast, then a faceless threat to his friends. His pulse picked up. Sweat stung his eyes. He lunged. Wind burst from his palms in rapid bursts, one to the side to unbalance, one to the torso to push, another to the legs to sweep. The dummy rocked, then toppled onto the sand with a dull thud. "Again," Gyatso said. They repeated the exercise with variations, closer range, wider arcs, defensive patterns. Aang's blows grew sharper, his steps lighter, his reactions more instinctive. He wasn't thinking Avatar. He was thinking, that blast is headed for someone I love. Move. On one particularly focused strike, he felt a surge of something deeper. The air around him didn't just rush, it roared, responding to a thread of power that hummed in his bones. A sudden flash of white tinged his vision, and the gust he released hit the dummy so hard it snapped the wooden post behind it and sent both crashing into the wall. Sand exploded in a cloud. Aang stumbled backward, eyes wide. Gyatso's expression flickered, not with fear, but recognition. Did I do that? Aang asked, chest heaving. Gyatso approached the dented wall, fingertips brushing the new crack in the stone. Yes, he said softly, and you will do much more if we channel it correctly. Aang swallowed. The knot of fear tried to rise again, but this time it tangled with something else. A spark of awe. He had done that. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in strokes of orange, purple, and deepening blue, Gyatso finally clapped his hands. That's enough, he said. If we train you any more today, you'll fall asleep in the soup. Aang flopped onto his back in the sand, arms spread wide. I might anyway, he groaned. Gyatso chuckled, extending a hand to help him up. Come, there's still one more lesson. I thought we were done, Aang complained, though he took the hand. Spiritual training, Gyatso said. Very advanced. We climb a mountain, we sit, and we try not to fall off while contemplating the meaning of existence. Aang sighed dramatically. Can't we just do more tornadoes? Existence lasts longer than tornadoes, Gyatso said. Best to prepare. They ascended to the highest peak of the southern temple, a narrow ledge that jutted out over the valley like the prow of a ship sailing through clouds. The wind was stronger here, wilder. It tugged at Aang's hair, and robes tried to pry his staff from his fingers. He sat cross-legged at the edge, the drop beneath him disappearing into white mist. The rivers below looked like thin scratches in the earth. Distant villages were nothing more than pale dots. From up here, the world seemed so small. How many people are down there? Aang asked quietly. More than we can count, Gyatso said, settling beside him. Families, children, farmers, fishermen, people who've never heard your name, people who never will. And I'm supposed to protect them, Aang said. Gyatso didn't answer right away. The wind carried the distant cry of a hawk. Clouds drifted lazily by, casting shadows that crawled over the mountains. You are supposed to try, he said eventually. You will not always succeed. You will make mistakes. You will fail people sometimes. Aang winced, but Gyatso pressed on gently. That is part of being alive. Part of being Avatar is choosing to keep trying anyway. Aang hugged his knees to his chest, chin resting atop them. What if I let everyone down? Gyatso smiled sadly. You won't. How do you know? Aang asked. Because, Gyatso said, looking out at the horizon, you have already chosen not to run. Aang thought of waking up before dawn, of going to the shrine instead of pretending nothing had happened. He remembered the tremble in his hands, the tightness in his chest, and how he had walked anyway. Maybe that counted for something. They sat in silence for a while, letting the sky change color around them. The first stars appeared, winking faintly in the deepening blue. Aang closed his eyes and tried to feel something. The breath of the world, the pulse beneath everything. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he felt distant voices, soft as whispers, old as stone. Not words exactly, just presence. When he opened his eyes, Gyatso was watching him with a knowing expression. "What?" Aang asked. "Nothing," Gyatso said. "Just making sure you don't topple over. The world would be very annoyed with me if I let the Avatar roll off a cliff on his first day." Aang snorted. "Yeah, that would be pretty bad." They descended as the first lanterns were lit around the temple. The smell of evening incense drifted through the halls. Monks chanted softly in the distance, weaving a low, steady hum through the stone corridors. Weeks passed. The days blurred into a rhythm of breath, motion, and quiet. At sunrise, Aang trained his body, airbending forms, gliding runs off cliff edges, balance drills that had him standing on moving air balls while juggling stones. At midday, he trained his mind. Gyatso quizzed him on the history of the four nations, the patterns of past wars, the philosophies of peace. "What is the difference between balance and control?" Gyatso would ask. "Balance is," Aang would begin, then pause, frowning, trying to push past the easy answer. At night, he trained his spirit. They meditated under the stars in the temple gardens, candles flickering in a circle around them. Sometimes, Aang dozed off and tilted sideways, only to be caught by a soft gust of wind summoned by Gyatso's fingers. He dreamed more vividly than ever, of oceans that glowed with white light, of forests where spirits in animal shapes watched him from the trees, of sky bison flying over a world split by fire. Once, he jolted awake with his arrow tattoos faintly tingling, his heart pounding in a rhythm that did not feel entirely his own. The air in his room had been swirling gently, lifting the corners of his blanket. He told Gyatso about it the next morning. "Good," Gyatso said simply, as if Aang had reported that he'd grown an inch. "The Avatar spirit is stretching its limbs." "Stretching its limbs inside me?" Aang asked, unnerved. "Would you rather it stretch them outside you?" Gyatso countered. "No." "Then practice your breathing." As weeks turned into a month, Aang's movements sharpened. He could hold himself inside an updraft column for several breaths now, eyes closed, hands still. His mini cyclones lasted longer and grew more precise. He could lift a ring of leaves around Gyatso without knocking the old monk's hat off. Sometimes, during intense sparring, the world narrowed to a single point, his body moving with frightening ease, as if guided by something older, deeper, and utterly sure. Those moments scared him almost as much as they thrilled him. He also began to notice something else. The air carried more than just wind. Messages traveled on it, snatches of conversation from travelers passing through the mountain roads miles below, carried upward. Fire Nation ships in the south. Villages burned. The Earth King doing nothing. Once, during meditation, a distant sound rippled through his awareness. A boom like thunder that didn't come from the sky. It faded quickly, but it left a strange taste in his mouth, metal and smoke. When he told Gyatso about it, the monk's brows knit together. "The world is restless," Gyatso said quietly. "The Fire Nation grows bolder every season." "Will they come here?" Aang asked. Gyatso hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "This temple is hidden," he said. "Difficult to reach. We are peaceful. There is no reason for them to—" He stopped himself, lips pressing into a thin line. Aang heard the unspoken part anyway. There is no reason. But war rarely listens to reason. Later that week, Aang overheard two elder monks speaking in hushed tones near the library. "We should send word to the other temples," one said. "The Northern Air Temple has already reported Fire Nation scouts near their air currents," the other replied. If we light our signal fires, it may draw attention. If we do nothing, it may draw worse, the first countered. Aang slipped away before they saw him, stomach churning. That night, he sat awake long after the candles had burned low, listening to the wind moan softly around the temple spires. One evening, when the moon was a thin silver slice in the sky, Aang and Gyatso walked the outer walkway that hugged the mountain's edge. Clouds pressed close, brushing the railings. The world below was hidden by mist. "Master," Aang said suddenly, "if the Fire Nation comes, what do we do?" Gyatso's hands folded into his sleeves. For once, he didn't deflect with a joke. "We defend those we can," he said. "We flee with those we must. We avoid needless bloodshed." He paused, turning to look at Aang fully. The wind tugged at his beard. "And we keep the Avatar alive." Aang looked away, throat tight. He didn't ask the next question. What if the Avatar can't keep everyone else alive? Because he already knew the answer. They can't, not always. The knowledge settled over him like a thin layer of cold. Days later, just before midnight, Aang sat in the courtyard under the lanterns, legs dangling over the edge of a low wall. Most of the temple was asleep. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chant of late-night prayer drifted through the air. He spun his staff absent-mindedly, using tiny gusts of air to keep it hovering between his palms. The exercise usually calmed him. Tonight, his thoughts wouldn't settle. The air felt off, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the sky holds its breath. He frowned, closing his eyes and inhaling deeply. The wind slid against his skin, around the pillars, through the empty corridors. It carried the usual scents: stone, incense, pine, but underneath them, a muffled sound, distant but distinct, a shout, then another, then the sharp crack of something heavy colliding with stone. Aang's eyes snapped open. The staff dropped into his lap. He didn't know how he knew exactly. The realization wasn't in his ears so much as in his bones, a tremor running up from the floor and into his spine. The temple was under attack. For a second, Aang thought he'd imagined it. The courtyard around him was unchanged, lantern light flickering in warm circles on the stone, shadows stretching long from the columns, the carved dragons frozen in their eternal roar. The night air was cool and clear. Stars pricked through the fabric of the sky. But there it was again. A shout, louder this time. Not the focused cry of a training match or the playful yelling of acolytes roughhousing after dark. This was ragged, panicked, the kind of sound people made when they suddenly remembered how breakable their bodies were. Then, a crash, stone on stone, wood splintering. Aang's stomach tightened. The hairs along his arms stood up. He slid off the wall, staff already in his hands. "Master Gyatso?" he called, voice sounding too small in the open air. No answer. The wind at his back seemed to push him toward the inner halls. He ran. Bare feet slapped against cold stone as he sprinted across the courtyard and into the cloistered walkway. The usual calm of the temple, scrolls neatly stored, shoes lined along walls, incense resting in silent braziers, felt wrong now, like a peaceful painting slapped over a roaring storm. He turned a corner. A door burst open ahead of him, nearly colliding with his face. A young acolyte stumbled out, eyes wide, breath hitching in sharp gasps. His shaved head was dusted with powdered stone. "Aang!" he yelped, grabbing at him. "There..." Before he could finish, a sound rolled through the air, deep and unnatural. A horn. It echoed across the mountain like the bellow of some enormous beast. making the lantern flames tremble. It was followed by another, and then another, overlapping in a discordant chorus that made Aang's bones vibrate. He didn't need anyone to explain. He'd heard horns like that before, in Gyatso's cautionary stories and in the nightmares he never admitted to having. Fire Nation war horns. His heart flipped over. "Get to the inner dormitory," he told the acolyte, voice shaking but somehow sounding steady. "Stay low. Don't go out unless one of the elders tells you." "But go," Aang snapped, surprising them both. Something in his tone cut through the boy's panic. He nodded frantically and bolted down the hall. The horn sounded again, closer now. Beneath it, Aang could hear other things. The faint thump of distant explosions, the crackle of flames where there shouldn't be flames. He ran faster, darting through open archways, taking staircases 2 steps at a time. His staff beat a frantic rhythm against his palm. At the top of the main stairway that led down to the central courtyard, he skidded to a stop. From this vantage, he could see past the temple roofs, over the outer balconies, and far beyond the mountain's edge. The horizon, usually so serene, was marred by shapes cutting across the sky, dark silhouettes with jagged prows and banners whipping in the wind. Fire Nation airships hadn't been invented yet, but their warships had learned to climb mountains. With the help of metal chains anchored into the rock and coal-burning engines belching smoke, 2 massive Fire Nation war barges were dragging themselves up the carved path that wound around the temple's base. Sparks flew where their reinforced hulls scraped against ancient stone. Behind them, more ships waited half-hidden by clouds, like sharks circling beneath the surface. Orange banners snapped and twisted, the flame emblem glaring even in the dark. As Aang watched, one of the forward cannons ignited, spilling molten light. The first shot hit an outer wall. The whole temple shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere below, someone screamed. Aang's breath came shallow. He'd imagined this moment before, so many times in anxious flashes, in what-ifs he chased away with jokes. In his mind, he'd always pictured himself doing something bold when it happened, something impressive. Leap off a roof and blow the ships away with a colossal gust of air. Call the sky down. But standing there, watching the Fire Nation claw its way up his home, he felt very small and very young. A hand landed on his shoulder. "Aang." Gyatso. The old monk's face was more serious than Aang had ever seen it. His usual warmth was there, but pressed underneath a tight layer of focus, like a candle behind thick glass. "We have to move," he said. Aang swallowed. "Master, I know," Gyatso cut in, but not unkindly. His fingers squeezed once, firm. "The elders are gathering the students. You and I will hold the inner courtyards long enough to evacuate everyone we can." "Hold them?" Aang repeated, voice cracking. "But there are ships, and soldiers, and there is the Avatar," Gyatso said sharply, eyes locking onto his. "And a very stubborn old monk who refuses to let his home burn without a fight." Aang's throat closed. "The world has come to your doorstep sooner than I hoped," Gyatso said, softer now. "But it has come. We don't have time to argue with reality. Breathe." Aang dragged air into his lungs. It stung, tasting of smoke that had no business being in an air temple. "Again," Gyatso said. Aang obeyed. Inhale, exhale, feel the ground under your feet, the wind at your back, the staff in your hands. "Good," Gyatso said. "Now we go." They descended the steps together into chaos. The inner courtyard, usually a place of quiet practice and afternoon games of airball, was bedlam. Acolytes sprinted across the stones in every direction. Some carried stacks of scrolls. Others dragged bundles of blankets and food, hurriedly piling them near the main hall. 2 elders stood at the far archway, shouting orders, directing children into the lower tunnels that led to hidden cliff paths. Above it all, the sky was streaked with smoke. The first Fire Nation troops had already breached the outer gates. They poured into the outer courtyards in waves of red and black, metal armor clanking, torches blazing. Jets of fire arc through the air, slamming into walls, shattering old wood, setting prayer flags alight. Aang saw one blast hit a row of clay statues, sending them crumbling into shards. Those had been carved by monks who died centuries ago. The sight made something hot twist in his chest. Gyatso stepped forward, staff spinning into his hand. "Aang," he said without looking back, "your priority is the students. Anyone you can shield, you do. Anyone you can move, you move. You do not chase glory. You do not chase vengeance. Understood?" Aang nodded, even though the part of him that had practiced and trained and glimpsed that frightening well of power wanted very badly to prove something. "Understood," he said. Gyatso took a breath, then slammed the end of his staff on the stone. A gust of wind exploded outward, rushing across the courtyard like a physical thing. It flattened flames, knocked a few panicking acolytes off their feet, but gently, like a giant hand shoving them into cover instead of into the enemy. The sudden change in air pressure rang through the temple. Heads turned. Fire Nation soldiers spilled into the inner courtyard a heartbeat later, ducking under a broken arch. Their helmets gleamed in the firelight, masks snarling. The lead soldiers raised their fists, heat blooming around them. Aang didn't have time to think. A group of younger children huddled near a toppled pillar, frozen in terror as a fireball barreled toward them. He launched himself into the air. The staff snapped open in his hands with a practiced flick, glider panels stretching wide. Wind rushed under them. Eager, Aang rode it like a wave, angling himself between the children and the approaching blast. He twisted his body mid-flight, dragging air with him. The fire hit the gust and broke apart, splitting into harmless sparks that scattered and died before reaching the kids. He landed in a crouch, heart pounding. The children stared at him with huge eyes. "Go!" he shouted, pointing toward the tunnel entrance. "Run! Don't stop until you're with the elders!" They obeyed, feet slapping against the stone as they bolted past him. Behind Aang, fire roared again. He spun, sweeping his staff in a horizontal arc. The wind responded in a strong gust, shoving 3 advancing soldiers back into a pile. Their flames sputtered out as they hit the ground. For a few seconds, he moved almost on instinct, ducking under jets of flame, sliding along spinning currents of air, knocking weapons from hands and redirecting fire bursts into empty space. He felt every shift in the air around him like ripples in a pond. The courtyard became a blur of orange and blue, fire and sky colliding. "Aang, left!" Gyatso's voice cut through the din. Without thinking, Aang dropped flat. A blast of compressed air roared over his head, slamming into a line of soldiers who'd been closing in. They flew backward, armor clanging, and crashed into a smoldering wall hard enough to crack stone. Gyatso landed beside him from some impossible angle, robes flaring, staff still humming with the force of the last strike. His calm was gone, replaced by something Aang had never seen in him before. Fury, not wild, not consuming, but focused and cold, like the center of a storm. "You will not harm my students," he said, voice carrying over the chaos with impossible clarity. For a heartbeat, even the Fire Nation soldiers hesitated. Then someone laughed. It wasn't the nervous, forced laughter of foot soldiers relying on bravado. It was low, amused, and wholly at ease. From the far archway, a figure stepped into the light. He wasn't dressed like the others. Where their armor was standard black and red, his was more ornate. Dark lacquered plates carved in the shape of overlapping dragon scales hugged his shoulders and chest. His helmet, held loosely under one arm, was shaped like a dragon's head, jaw open in a permanent snarl. His hair was pulled back tightly. His face was angular, clean-shaven, with a sharp jaw and high cheekbones. His eyes, cold and gray, moved over the burning courtyard with clinical interest, like a man inspecting a battlefield he'd already decided he owned. He walked through falling ash and scattered flames without hurry, each step measured. Fire seemed to bend away from him, not because he willed it, but because it knew he might. When he spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "So this is the mighty Southern Air Temple," he said. "Quaint." Aang felt a chill despite the heat. The soldiers around the man straightened, falling into tighter formation. A few exchanged quick glances, relief, respect, fear. Whoever he was important. "Aang," Gyatso said quietly, eyes never leaving the newcomer. "Stay close." "Who is that?" Aang whispered. Gyatso's jaw tightened. "Someone whose name you'll have the misfortune of remembering." As the man advanced, a small stone near his foot rolled and struck Aang's sandal. He looked down. Behind a cracked statue pedestal, half hidden by debris, a young acolyte peered out. Barely older than Aang, her cheeks were streaked with soot and tears. Her eyes flicked from the stranger to Aang, desperately searching his face for something. Hope, maybe. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "Aang, you have to help us." Her words weren't a demand. They weren't a command from a spirit or a prophecy written in ancient ink. They were a plea from someone whose world was collapsing. They hit Aang harder than any blast of fire. The stranger's gaze landed on Aang and Gyatso. He murmured, lips curling, "The boy Avatar with his doting shepherd." He raised his voice for the soldiers. "Focus on the elders and the tunnels. Cut off their escape. I'll handle these two." He stepped forward. Gyatso moved first. The old monk's staff snapped into motion with a speed that belied his age. He spun it in a tight circle, summoning a rolling wave of air that barreled toward the approaching officer. It tore up loose stones and kicked up dust, turning the ground between them into a temporary sandstorm. The officer didn't flinch. His hand swept out in a smooth, practiced gesture. Fire surged. It wasn't the wild, sputtering flame of an inexperienced soldier. This was controlled, concentrated, white-hot at the core. It drilled through the wave of air Gyatso had sent, punching a hole through the gust and dissipating the rest in a burst of steam and swirling embers. Gyatso pivoted, using the remaining air to launch himself sideways. The officer stepped into the space Gyatso had just vacated, thrusting his palm forward. A spear of fire ripped past where the monk's chest had been and smashed into a column, cracking it. Aang's heart lurched. "Gyatso!" "I'm fine," Gyatso grunted, landing in a low crouch. Pain flickered briefly across his face. His knee, maybe, but he pushed through it, whipping his staff up to block another blazing arc. The officer smiled, teeth bared. "You're nimble for a relic," he said, "but you're out of time." He lunged. Gyatso twisted, redirecting the slash of flame with a palm strike of air, sending it ricocheting safely upward. But the officer used the deflection as a feint, dropping low and drawing a blade from his hip in one fluid motion. Metal flashed. Gyatso barely got his staff in the way in time. The blade struck wood with a crack. The force reverberated up the monk's arms. For a fraction of a second, His footing slipped on the ash-slick stone. The officer's knee drove into Gyatso's ribs, knocking him back. He staggered, catching himself on one hand, breath leaving him in a sharp hiss. "Master!" Aang cried, something hot and ugly rising in his chest. He had been following orders, focusing on redirecting stray blasts, shepherding fleeing acolytes toward the tunnels. But seeing Gyatso stumble, the man who had always been unshakable, who always had a joke, who always seemed invincible in the quiet ways that mattered, something snapped. The fear that had been gnawing at his insides ignited. Fire in his heart, air in his veins. He didn't think, he moved. One moment he was standing near the tunnel entrance, the next he was hurtling across the courtyard, glider still closed, staff a blur in his hands. The wind responded to his anger like it had been waiting for it. Aang slammed his foot down, twisting his hips. A gust leapt from the ground, propelling him into a spinning kick. The officer raised his sword to parry, surprised by the speed. Aang's heel hit the blade, knocking it aside with a ringing clang. He followed with a sharp palm strike, sending a blast of compressed air straight into the man's chest. It was like punching a boulder. The officer slid back several steps, boots skidding, armor creaking. He dug his heels in and righted himself, the smallest hint of shock crossing his features before it twisted into something sharper. "Interesting," he said, voice low. "There's the Avatar." Around them, the battle momentarily blurred into background noise. Aang's world narrowed to that pale gaze and the thrum of power in his own hands. He was scared, terrified, but beneath the fear, something roared. "You hurt Gyatso! You're burning my home!" The air around Aang thickened, swirling in visible eddies. His arrow tattoos tingled faintly, like someone had traced them with ice. The officer's eyes narrowed. His stance shifted, no longer casual, no longer amused. He raised his free hand, fingers curling. Flame poured from his palm in a wide arc, a blazing fan that threatened to engulf Aang whole. Aang dropped low, sweeping his staff in a tight circle. The wind responded in a sudden swirl, forming a thin but fierce barrier that bent the flames upward. They roared overhead, washing the ceiling in orange light and heat. He rolled forward out of the heat, sand grinding into his skin, and came up inside the officer's reach. The man swung his sword down in a brutal overhead slash. Aang pivoted, using a small burst of air at his feet to slide out of range, the blade missing him by inches. He didn't fight like a warrior. He fought like air, never where the enemy wanted him to be. But the officer adapted quickly. His strikes were precise, economical, no wasted movement. Each slash of his sword flowed seamlessly into a fire-bending technique. A thrust became a jab of flame. A parry became a sudden jet from his elbow. Aang had to split his focus constantly. Staff here, gust there, duck, jump, spin. Every collision of fire and air filled the courtyard with steam and smoke. "Aang," Gyatso called, forcing himself upright. "Don't meet him head on. Bend away." Aang heard him, but his blood was up now. Each time the officer's blade came close, each time he saw Gyatso out of the corner of his eye holding his side, the anger surged back. He feinted left, then right, then sprang into a twisting flip, staff carving a circle in the air. A vortex formed around him mid-spin, a tighter, fiercer version of the little tornadoes they'd practiced. Sand and debris ripped up from the ground, whirling into a cone. He came down hard, slamming his palms into the stone. The cone of air exploded outward. It hit the officer like a hammer. His helmet flew from his hand, clattering across the courtyard. His feet left the ground as he was flung backward, slamming into a row of soldiers behind him. The whole cluster tumbled like scattered pins. The roar of the gust blew out several fires, sent banners snapping, and rattled loose tiles from the roof. Aang felt the shockwave in his teeth. He knelt there for a heartbeat, chest heaving, fingers digging into the cracks between stones. The world slowly reasserted itself around him. The shouts, the crackle of fire, the distant sobbing. The smell of smoke thick enough to coat his tongue. He looked up. The officer pushed himself to his feet, armor scorched, hair disheveled. Without his helmet, his face was bare, and Aang saw it clearly now. Those sharp features, the cruel twist to his mouth that looked like it had been practiced in the mirror. The cold, calculating eyes that measured him not as a boy, but as an obstacle. He'd heard that name whispered in fearful tones by traveling air nomads who'd passed through the temple months ago, by Earth Kingdom merchants sheltered in mountain villages, by Water Tribe sailors who'd shared stories with wandering monks. Admiral Zhao. Zhao wiped a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth, lips curling into a snarl. "You'll regret that, child," he said, voice low and venomous. "I will see you again, and when I do, I will burn everything you love." He glanced around quickly, taking in the state of the fight. The inner courtyard was still contested, but the tunnels were emptying. Too many students had already escaped. The element of surprise was gone. The mountain paths were treacherous even in daylight. Pushing deeper now would cost him more troops than the target was worth. He clicked his tongue in irritation. "Fall back!" he barked to his men. A few soldiers stared at him, incredulous. They weren't used to retreat orders from this man. Zhao's gaze snapped to them, icy. "Now!" Obedience won over pride. The Fire Nation soldiers began to withdraw, covering each other with bursts of flame as they moved back through the shattered archways. A few tried to snatch air nomad artifacts on their way out, statues, scrolls, anything that might be valuable, but an impatient flare from Zhao's hand sent them dropping their loot and running. Aang staggered to his feet, watching them go. His instinct screamed at him to chase them, to blow them off the mountain, to make sure they never came back. Gyatso's hand landed on his shoulder like an anchor. "Let them go," the monk said quietly. "But, Aang," there was iron in Gyatso's tone now. "Our victory is that our students still breathe. Do not trade that for vengeance." Aang clenched his jaw. Down below, Zhao paused at the outer edge of the courtyard and looked back. For a moment, their eyes met across the wreckage. Zhao lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a mock salute. Then he was gone, disappearing through smoke and broken stone, his men a red and black tide receding down the mountain path. The war horn's echoes faded, replaced by the crackle of dying fires and the low, broken sounds of people realizing they were still alive. The courtyard fell into an eerie half-silence. Aang's legs finally gave out. He sank to his knees, staff sliding from numb fingers. He pressed his hands to the stone, feeling the faint vibrations of the retreating soldiers under his palms. Then, slowly, those too faded, leaving only the tremble of his own exhausted muscles. His home was wrong. Charred beams jutted at odd angles. Beloved statues were reduced to rubble. A section of the wall that had held a mural of Avatar Yang Chen in flight was now just a jagged black smear. Ash fell from the air like gray snow, coating everything in a thin film of death. Aang's chest tightened, his eyes burned. He got up on shaking legs and walked. Neither Gyatso nor the remaining elders stopped him. They were busy, tending to the wounded, checking the tunnels, accounting for every face. Their voices rose and fell in hoarse calls, counting names like prayers. Aang drifted through the ruins like a ghost. He passed the training field where he'd spent so many afternoons laughing as he fell off his air scooter. The sand was scorched, the wooden dummies splintered and charred. The faint groove marks from his early glider practice were barely visible beneath the soot. He walked by the game court where he'd once cheated outrageously at airball to make his friends laugh. The painted lines were obscured by rubble. A shattered ball lay in a corner, half melted. In the garden, a few stubborn flowers still clung to life among the blackened shrubs. A single lotus bloomed near the edge of the koi pond, petals dusted with ash but still defiantly pink under the moonlight. Aang knelt beside it. His fingers, still trembling, brushed away the soot clinging to its petals. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He wasn't sure who he was apologizing to. The flower? The temple? The monks who'd built it centuries ago? Himself? All of them. The temple answered only with the soft drip of water and the distant crash of a collapsed wall, finally giving up and crumbling. The moon rode high by the time he found Gyatso again. The old monk stood in the main hall, framed by the shattered doorway. His staff was planted beside him, his shoulders bowed with exhaustion. Around them, the remnants of the Southern Air Temple lay in pieces. Aang joined him at the threshold, eyes tracing the broken shapes of his home. "Did we win?" he asked. The question sounded childish even to his own ears. Gyatso took a long breath. "We are alive," he said. "Many of our students escaped. The Fire Nation has left, at least for now." He looked at Aang, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been that morning. "In war," he said softly, "that is what passes for winning." Aang's throat ached. "They'll come back." "Yes," Gyatso said simply. "Now that they know for certain the Avatar lives here, they will not forget this mountain." Aang swallowed, the bitter taste of ash still on his tongue. "So, what do we do?" Gyatso turned fully to face him. The lantern light caught the streaks of gray in his hair, the smudges of soot, the bruise forming along his jaw where Zhao's knee had caught him. "We leave," he said. The word hit Aang like a physical blow. "Leave?" he echoed. "But this is the Southern Air Temple. It's our home? We can rebuild?" "Aang," Gyatso's voice was gentle, but it cut through his protest. "We are air nomads. Our home is not in stone and wood. It is in our way of life, in our teachings, in one another." He gestured to the ruined hall. "This place has served its purpose. It gave you roots. It gave you training. It gave you time. Now it is a beacon, drawing fire. If we stay, the Fire Nation will return with more men, more ships, more destruction. They will level the mountain if they have to." He stepped closer, placing both hands on Aang's shoulders. "The world needs the Avatar, Aang," he said quietly. "Not a pile of stones where the Avatar used to live." Aang wanted to argue, to cling to the walls, to the gardens, to the echo of laughter in the dormitories, to the feeling that if he just sat in the shrine a little longer, the past avatars might tell him what to do. But he thought of the terrified eyes of the acolytes, of the way Zhao had said, "I will see you again," of the ships wheezing their way up the mountain, ugly and relentless. He thought of the whispers the wind had carried to him for weeks now. Villages burned, boats sunk, borders breached. Maybe the world wouldn't fit into this mountain anymore. His fingers tightened around his staff. "Where will we go?" he asked, voice small. Gyatso's gaze drifted south, toward where the horizon fell away into darkness and, far beyond that, endless water. "First to the sea," he said. "Then, wherever the Avatar is most needed." He straightened with a soft groan. patting Aang's shoulder once before moving into the hall. "Help me gather what we can carry. We leave at dawn." The night passed in a blur of movement. They salvaged what was most essential: a few bundles of scrolls containing key air nomad teachings and bending techniques, some herbs and medicines from the infirmary, a handful of tools, food compressed into travel cakes. Aang's hands shook twice when he reached for familiar objects: the carved toy bison Gyatso had given him when he was 5, the old airball from a championship match he'd won, and then pulled back. There wasn't room. Not for everything. He went to the shrine of the Avatar one last time. The statues loomed as they had that morning, but now the light that filtered in was flickering and smoky. Cracks marred the floor. A chunk of the ceiling had fallen, shearing through part of Avatar Karuk's carved shoulder. Aang stepped into the center of the circle, staff held loosely in his hand. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he said quietly to the stone faces. "I don't know if leaving is what you would have done. I don't know if going out there is better than staying here." His voice wobbled, but he kept going. "But the Fire Nation knows about me now. Zhao knows. And if I stay, they'll just keep coming until there's nothing left." He swallowed. "If I go, maybe I can stop them somewhere else. Maybe I can help more people than just the ones on this mountain." He looked up at Avatar Roku's stern, damaged face. "If this is the wrong choice," he said, "I'm sorry, I'm trying." Silence answered him, deep and heavy. Then, very softly, a breeze slipped through the broken ceiling. It wrapped around his shoulders like a shawl, cool and gentle, lifting a few cherry blossoms that had somehow found their way back into the shrine. They swirled around him once, twice, then settled at his feet. Aang's eyes stung. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." The sky was just beginning to pale when they stood at the outer gate. What was left of the temple spread out behind them in the dim light. Those who remained, a smaller group than had lived there weeks before, gathered in a loose cluster. Elder monks, a handful of acolytes too old or too stubborn to be sent to the safer hiding places, a few injured airbenders leaning on staffs. Gyatso swept his gaze over them, eyes bright. "This temple has done its duty," he said. "We will honor it not by clinging to its bones, but by carrying its spirit into the wider world. Remember that the air nomad way is more than these walls." He turned to Aang. The boy took a deep breath and stepped forward. He rested a hand on the cracked stone of the gate. Memories poured through him. Snowball fights with other kids, sneaking extra dessert from the kitchens, his first successful glider flight, Gyatso laughing until he wheezed, meditating badly, meditating well, worrying, hoping. Thank you," he murmured to the temple. Then he opened his glider. The golden panels unfurled with a familiar flutter. The wind, as if recognizing the sound, rushed up to meet him. He ran a few steps and leapt off the edge. For a moment, he fell. Then the air caught him, lifting the glider gently. He soared out over the chasm, the ruined temple shrinking behind him. Gyatso followed on his own glider, more stable, more practiced, the rest of the group taking narrow hidden paths down the mountain. The morning sun broke over the horizon, shedding new light on an old world. As Aang banked southward, distant rivers glinting like molten silver, a knot of grief and fear twisted in his chest. But threaded through it, faint but unmistakable, was something else. Purpose. Aang didn't sleep that night. Not really. His eyes closed a few times, but every time they did, he saw the temple walls cracking, heard Zhao's laughter echoing off the stone, felt the blast of fire heat his cheeks. He saw the lotus in the garden, still blooming under a blanket of ash, and he didn't know whether that made things better or worse. So when dawn finally bled across the horizon, he was already awake, glider staff across his knees, watching the world shift from blue to gold. Below him, the mountain winds howled softly, carrying bits of soot from the ruins behind him. Gyatso stood nearby, tightening the straps of a small bundle he'd fashioned from salvaged temple cloth. The other monks and acolytes, those who had chosen to follow Aang into the world instead of scattering into hidden air nomad enclaves, waited in respectful silence, some perched on gliders, others preparing to descend the narrow paths carved into the cliff face. Aang rose. The sleeve of his robe still smelled faintly of smoke. Gyatso nodded to him. "The river runs south for many miles," he said. "If we follow it toward the ocean, we can reach villages untouched by the Fire Nation, at least for now. We will rest there, replenish our supplies, and determine where the Avatar is most needed." Aang swallowed and nodded. The word Avatar felt different today. Heavier, closer, like it had crept under his skin overnight instead of floating somewhere above him. He didn't feel ready. He didn't think he ever would. But he had already left the only home he'd ever known. There was no turning back. The group began their descent, Gyatso leading them along a narrow stone path that looped around the mountain like a ribbon clinging desperately to the rock. Aang opted to glide instead, unfurling his staff and stepping off the ledge into cold morning air. The wind caught him immediately, lifting him with a soft whoosh that made his heart flutter. For a moment, just a moment, Aang let himself enjoy it. Flying had always been his refuge, his escape, his joy. Today it was a reminder the world was vast, and he was only now touching its edge. He soared beside Gyatso as the path wound downward, watching the temple grow smaller and smaller behind them. It looked fragile from this distance. Broken walls, collapsed roofs, blackened courtyards, a shell of what it had been. Aang's stomach twisted again. Gyatso must have sensed it. "Look ahead," he said quietly, "not behind." Aang tried. Below the cliffs, the river gleamed like a silver dragon weaving through the forest. Trees bowed over its banks, green and lively and untouched by fire. Birds darted between branches. The morning fog clung to the surface of the water like a sleepy guardian spirit. It was beautiful. And somewhere out there, beyond the river bend, beyond the forest and valleys and whatever waited at the ocean, people were suffering. Villages were burning. Families were running. The air carried whispers of it still. Aang could feel them threading through the wind. It made his heart beat faster, but not from fear, from urgency. They followed the river all day, stopping only when the sun dipped toward the horizon. By then, the landscape had changed. Mountains giving way to rolling hills, the river widening as it meandered south. They made camp under a cluster of pines beside the water. Gyatso taught the younger acolytes how to build windbreaks using only bending, and Aang gathered driftwood for a small cooking fire. He kept glancing at the sky. Part of him expected to see the silhouette of a Fire Nation ship descending from the clouds, or hear the screech of metal as Zhao dragged another monstrous barge up a cliff face. But the sky remained clear. The only sound was the rush of the river and the soft chirp of evening insects. As the others settled into quiet conversations or meditation, Aang sat alone on a log, stirring the sand with his staff. Gyatso approached without a sound and settled beside him. "You've been quiet," the monk observed. Aang didn't answer right away. He kept drawing circles unconsciously into the dirt, an old nervous habit. Finally, he spoke. Master, do you think if we had stayed, could we have stopped them? Stop Zhao? Gyatso asked. Aang's throat tightened. He nodded. Gyatso exhaled slowly, watching the ripples dance across the river. We could have fought, he said, and we would have lost. The bluntness stung. Aang looked away. You showed great strength today, Gyatso continued, gentler now. Strength far beyond what most your age could even fathom. But the Fire Nation sends more than strength. They send numbers, steel, machines, and ambition so deep it does not hear the word no. Aang's fingers dug into the sand. But if I were stronger, you are 12, Gyatso said firmly, and you faced an admiral of the Fire Nation and lived. Do you understand how few people in the world can say that? Aang blinked. But you, Gyatso smiled faintly. I have lived many years. I have fought many battles. My strength is borrowed from time. Yours is borrowed from destiny. Aang didn't know what to say to that. His chest felt warm and cold at the same time. After a moment, he whispered, Zhao said he'd come back. Yes. Gyatso's eyes hardened. He will. And he said he would burn everything I love. Silence stretched between them. Gyatso reached out and laid a hand over Aang's, stopping his restless circles in the sand. Listen to me carefully, the monk said. Zhao is not fate. He is not prophecy. He is not the end of your story. He is a man, flawed, angry, and afraid of anything he cannot control. Aang looked up, startled. Afraid? Gyatso nodded. Only those who fear the light seek to snuff out every spark. Zhao sees you as a threat because he knows what the Avatar represents. Aang swallowed. Peace? Balance, Gyatso corrected. True balance terrifies tyrants. The fire crackled softly beside them. Smoke drifted upward in thin lines, disappearing into the canopy. They sat like that for a while. Eventually, Gyatso rose. Rest, Aang. Tomorrow will be long. Aang didn't argue. Once he lay back on his bedroll, exhaustion crept into his bones. His eyes grew heavy. Before sleep claimed him fully, he whispered into the night, I won't let him burn anything else. The next morning, they glided further south. Hours passed beneath them. Forests, cliffs, open plains. The river widened again, splitting into several branches before merging once more. By noon, the scent of salt hung faintly in the wind. Aang's pulse quickened. He had never seen the ocean before. When it finally appeared, an endless expanse of shimmering blue stretching far beyond the horizon, his breath caught. The waves crashed rhythmically along a curved coastline, dotted with small villages. Fishing boats bobbed in the water. Seagulls swooped playfully overhead. It was peaceful. Or it should have been. As they descended along the shoreline, Aang's eyes narrowed. Smoke rose from one of the distant villages. Thick, black smoke. Fire-consuming wood. A scream carried across the wind. Aang didn't think. He dove. Gyatso shouted something behind him, but the wind stole the words away. Aang angled the glider down sharply, air rushing past him as he sped toward the burning settlement. The smell of charred wood hit him first. Then the sight. Half the village already in flames. Water tribe women dragging children toward the cliffs. Warriors trying in vain to repel a group of Fire Nation soldiers torching every hut they passed. Aang's stomach dropped. He flicked his staff, catching an updraft, and swooped low to the sand. A fire blast streaked toward two crying children tied to posts. Aang landed between them and the flame. His staff whipped forward. A concentrated gust burst from his palms, splitting the fire into harmless sparks. The soldiers froze, momentarily stunned. Aang didn't give them time to recover. He spun, sending a cyclone of sand into their ranks. Warriors crashed into each other, sputtering as grit blasted their faces. More soldiers surged from behind burning huts. Aang met them head-on. He vaulted over a blast of fire, using a quick burst of air to redirect it upward. He swept the legs out from under another soldier with a spinning kick. He leapt into the air, riding a self-summoned air bubble over a wall of flames. He wasn't the scared boy from the courtyard anymore. He was motion. He was instinct. He was wind unleashed. A soldier aimed a direct blast at his chest. Aang slapped it away with the flat of his hand, redirecting the heat into the sand where it vaporized instantly. He didn't notice the girl running toward him until she skidded into view, hair whipping behind her, a carved wooden flute strapped at her hip. Aang's heart stuttered. He knew that necklace. He knew those eyes. Katara. Her face was streaked with soot, but her determination burned hotter than any fire thrown that day. Behind her, Sokka sprinted with a makeshift club, yelling something that might have been meant to intimidate but mostly sounded panicked. Katara raised her arms. A column of water rose from the nearby shoreline, swirling around her as she bent it into a spiraling whip. She lashed it toward a squad of advancing soldiers, ice forming at the tip just before it struck. 3 soldiers toppled backward, armor iced over. Aang couldn't help it. Despite the chaos, despite the smoke stinging his eyes, he felt something spark inside him. Admiration, wonder, connection. Then Gyatso landed beside him with a dramatic gust, staff spinning as he knocked a fire blast harmlessly aside. "Focus," the monk murmured. "Right, focus." Together, Aang, Gyatso, Katara, Sokka, they pushed deeper into the village, air and water bending in harmony to extinguish flames and drive the raiders back. Sand blew in controlled spirals. Water crashed in powerful waves. Fire hissed and sputtered under the combined forces of sky and sea. And for the first time in days, Aang felt that small spark again. Hope. There was more to come, much more. But in this moment, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who already felt like allies, he understood something. He wasn't facing the world alone. Not anymore. The moon hung low and full over the icy expanse when Aang finally allowed himself to stop moving. His breath came out in white clouds as he stood on the upper balcony of the Northern Water Tribe Palace, staring out at the shimmering wall of ice that protected the city. The battle had ended only hours earlier, but its echoes still pulsed faintly in the frozen air. Distant shouts of healers, the rasp of guards dragging debris away from the breached outer wall, the muffled sob of a child reunited with a parent. Aang had lived through battles before now, 2 of them, in fact, but this one felt different, because this time, he hadn't just defended a handful of students or a single burning village. He had defended a nation, and the Fire Nation had answered with everything it had. Katara joined him quietly, wrapped in a thick blue parka that fluttered in the wind. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood beside him, arms crossed against the cold, eyes following the slow drift of lantern lights below. Aang exhaled. "They're going to regroup, aren't they?" Katara nodded, jaw tightening. Zhao won't accept defeat, not when he thinks taking the north will make him a legend. Aang's fingers curled around the railing until his knuckles whitened. The cold bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. "He controlled the spirit serpents," Aang said softly. "I could feel it, not like he was commanding them, but like he'd stolen something that didn't belong to him." Katara's breath hitched. That charm he carried. That golden talisman. She looked at Aang. You saw it too? I felt it, he corrected, like it pulled at the water in my chest. Katara shivered. Zhao using spirit power. It shouldn't be possible. Aang didn't reply, because if Zhao could influence spirits now, what would he attempt next? What would Ozai attempt? A new chill, not from the wind, crawled up his spine. Below them, Gyatso walked alongside Master Pakku, the two elders deep in hushed conversation as they evaluated the damage. Aang watched Gyatso's steps, steady but slower than usual. He'd taken a hard hit in the battle, too hard. Aang pushed away from the railing. I need to check on him. Katara caught his sleeve gently. Aang, you can't pour from an empty cup. He blinked, confused. You haven't slept, she said. You barely ate. You fought Zhao, his soldiers, the serpents, and then helped put out the fires. She offered a small, sad smile. Even the Avatar needs rest. Aang shook his head. People were hurt because of me today. Katara frowned. People were saved because of you today. Her voice carried a conviction so steady it made Aang's breath catch. The sincerity in her eyes reminded him of that moment at the burned village, her hand gripping his shoulder, promising him her trust before he had done anything to deserve it. He looked away, cheeks warming despite the cold. Sokka burst onto the balcony before the silence had time to settle. Hey, you two! He paused, panting. Pakku wants to see you, says it's urgent. Aang straightened immediately. Katara exchanged a worried glance with Sokka, then followed as Aang rushed inside through the carved ice archway. The palace interior glowed with soft blue light, torches flickering behind walls sculpted into spiraling patterns of frost. Aang's footsteps echoed against the ice. They reached the central chamber where Master Pakku stood by a frozen map table, arms crossed. His expression was more severe than usual. Gyatso stood beside him, leaning subtly on his staff. Aang instinctively moved toward his mentor. Master, Gyatso lifted a hand. I'm all right, Aang, just bruised. Pakku summoned you for another reason. Pakku gestured toward the map, a glowing projection of the northern waterways. Zhao's flagship retreated, he said, tapping one of the glowing lines. But reports from the southern scouts suggest he is gathering reinforcements at the mouth of the Serpent's Pass. Sokka paled. The same pass we came through? The very same, Pakku confirmed. If Zhao intends to strike again, he will do so with overwhelming force. Aang stepped closer to the map. It flickered as he approached, the current shifting under his shadow. But the northern walls held, Aang said. We forced them back once. We can do it again. Pakku shook his head. Zhao now knows our capabilities. He will not storm the walls a second time. He will attack from a place we cannot defend. Katara's breath hitched. The spirit oasis. The room fell silent. Pakku's jaw tightened. If Zhao harms Tui and La, the entire world will suffer. Aang felt the weight of the statement settle on his shoulders like a slab of ice. We won't let him reach the oasis, he said firmly. Gyatso placed a steadying hand on Aang's back. The Avatar spirit protects balance, he said, but the boy must be protected as well. Pakku nodded reluctantly. Aang, Katara, Gyatso, you will travel ahead of Zhao's fleet. Get to the oasis before him. If he makes a move toward the spirits, you must stop him at any cost. Sokka raised his hand. Hello? Warrior of the group here. I'm coming too. Pakku looked at him. You are... adequate. Sokka puffed up. I'll take it. Aang turned back to the map, tracing the glowing lines with his fingertip. The river routes twisted like veins, alive, shifting. The spirit oasis felt impossibly far, but the memory of Zhao's voice, "You'll regret this, child," burned hotter and brighter than any fire. "When do we leave?" Aang asked. Paku's eyes held a flicker of something like respect. "Immediately." The sky outside was dark as they prepared, but the city glowed with blue firelight and spirit lanterns. Katara filled skins with water, Sokka sharpened his boomerang, and Gyatso checked the straps of his glider with restless hands. Aang stepped away from them, just for a moment, and walked to the edge of the palace terrace. The ocean spread before him, vast and cold. The sounds of battle still echoed in his head, but tonight he felt something stronger than fear: resolve. The world was already changing. The Fire Nation wasn't slowing down. Zhao wasn't finished. Ozai wasn't finished. And darkness was waiting in places Aang had never even seen. But he wasn't the scared boy from the southern shrine anymore. He tightened his grip on his staff. The Avatar was moving, and the world would feel it. Without another word, he stepped off the terrace and let the wind take him. Aang dove into the night air, letting the wind wrap around him like an old friend, steady, certain, and endlessly patient. The icy world blurred beneath him as he angled toward the northern riverways, the soft blue glow of the Water Tribe city fading behind him. The moon hung high overhead, casting silver ripples across the frozen canals. But even its gentle light felt tense tonight, as if it too sensed the current shifting in ways none of them could yet see. Katara and Sokka glided behind him on a Water Tribe skiff, retrofitted with ice runners, while Gyatso circled above them, his silhouette a dark streak against the sky. Their breath came out in clouds. The air was thin and cold enough to sting Aang's cheeks, but the adrenaline in his veins kept him warm. The closer they got to the spirit oasis, the quieter the world became. Snowdrifts muffled their steps. Frost crystallized on the edges of their clothes. Even the river slowed here, as though reluctant to disturb the sacred ground beyond. Katara drew closer, her voice a whisper. "Aang, the spirits will be watching. We can't approach this place with fear." Aang nodded, though his insides knotted tighter with every passing second. He had never been to a spirit sanctuary before, not one where the veil between worlds thinned like a breath on cold glass. The air shimmered faintly ahead of them, distorting the path like heat over desert sands. Gyatso landed beside them, folding his glider with deliberate care. "Stay close," he said softly, "and do not speak unless spoken to. The spirits are old, and they do not appreciate unnecessary noise." Sokka immediately straightened his posture and puffed out his chest. "I'm the definition of quiet dignity." Katara groaned. "Please stop talking." They continued deeper into the icy cavern, until the walls slowly widened, opening into a breathtaking oasis lit by soft blue fire. A warm breeze brushed Aang's face. Steam rose from a pool of impossibly clear water, glowing faintly from within. Tiny white fish darted just beneath the surface, leaving trails of shimmering light behind them. At the center of the oasis grew a single ancient tree, its twisted roots spreading out over rocks worn smooth by centuries. It pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, like a heartbeat. Aang exhaled in awe. "It's beautiful." "This is the center of our world," Katara whispered. "The moon and ocean spirits, Tui and La, are one in this place." For a moment, just a sliver, they all felt safe, protected, balanced. Then the water rippled. Aang's head snapped up. Cold pricked his spine. Gyatso's expression sharpened. "We are not alone." A faint tremor hummed beneath the ice. Sokka tightened his grip on his boomerang. Katara lifted her water skin, ready to bend. Aang closed his eyes. He listened. Beyond the rustle of the tree, beyond the gentle glow of the spirits, beyond the quiet of the oasis. There, heavy footsteps, muffled voices, a metallic clank, the scent of smoke and steel. Wrong in a place like this. Aang's eyes flew open. "They're already here!" They rushed toward the cavern entrance just as the shadows started to move. Fire Nation soldiers crept forward in tight formation, using the cavern walls for cover. Their armor gleamed in the moonlight. Their breaths fogged in the cold air. At their front marched a familiar figure, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. Admiral Zhao. Even here, where the spirit light softened the world, Zhao's presence felt like a stain across the snow. "Well then," Zhao said, voice echoing off the frozen walls. "I thought I smelled the stench of hope lingering here." Sokka bristled. "Is that a fancy way of saying you forgot to bathe?" Zhao ignored him completely. His eyes were locked on Aang. "Avatar." Zhao smiled without warmth. "You flee your temple, you flee your destiny, and yet you keep stumbling into my path. How considerate." Aang stepped forward, heart hammering. "Leave this place. You don't belong here. No firebender does." Zhao's smile widened. "Even better. That means no one will mourn when I take what I came for." Gyatso's voice cut the air like a blade. "You know nothing of balance, Zhao. Leave before the spirits themselves awaken." Zhao lifted the golden talisman he wore around his neck, a swirling, glassy charm that hummed with unnatural energy. "Oh, I intend to awaken something?" A pulse of light flickered through the ice. The water in the oasis trembled violently. Aang's breath caught. "What are you doing?" Zhao raised the talisman higher, and the spirits reacted instantly. White and black koi fish swirling wildly, their once graceful dance breaking out of its eternal rhythm. The oasis glowed brighter. Too bright. Katara cried out as the water surged toward Zhao in a spiraling vortex, but he only laughed, redirecting the surge with a violent burst of fire that boiled the water mid-air. He wasn't bending at the water. He was bending the spirits. Aang's stomach dropped in icy horror. "Stop!" Aang leapt into motion, riding a jet of air that sent him soaring toward Zhao. Zhao snapped his arm forward, unleashing a whip of golden flame, far hotter and faster than any regular fire blast. Aang barely dodged, the heat searing past his ear. Katara sent a wave of freezing water sweeping at Zhao's legs. He countered with a thrust of darkened flame, evaporating her attack before it reached him. Sokka hurled his boomerang. It ricocheted off Zhao's gauntlet with a dull clang and spun uselessly away. Gyatso moved last, and when he moved like a storm. Wind exploded outward in a spiraling barrier that forced Zhao to skid backward, boots screeching across ice. The golden talisman flickered, almost dimming. Zhao snarled and clutched it tighter. "You old fool!" he spat. "Stand aside! Never!" Aang felt the shift in the air before he saw it. Zhao lunged, not toward Gyatso, not toward Katara, but straight toward the oasis. Aang lunged after him. "No!" But Zhao was faster than he had any right to be. He plunged his hand into the sacred pool. Water flashed white hot. Spirits screamed in the air. And from the glow beneath the water, Zhao tore Tui from its eternal dance. The white koi fish convulsed in his grip, its light flickering desperately. Katara screamed. The water in the oasis erupted violently. The world dimmed as if someone had drawn a curtain across the moon. Aang felt the Avatar spirit flinch inside him. A ripple of cold swept through his bones, squeezing his lungs, blurring his vision. Zhao lifted the trembling koi fish high above the water. "Tonight," he said, eyes wild, "the moon will die." Gyatso's face drained of color. Katara fell to her knees as the water around her went still. Aang felt something inside him snap. He didn't think, he didn't bend, he moved. The air obeyed him before his brain caught up. The ground vanished beneath his feet. His arrow tattoos glowed faintly, too faintly, fighting against a darkness that was rising fast and thick as ink. Zhao's arm arced downward. Aang reached him, and the oasis went dark. The moon vanished from the sky. Katara screamed again, this time not in fear, but in agony. Sokka staggered backward, nearly slipping on the ice. Gyatso clutched his chest, gasping as though someone had ripped the breath from his lungs. Aang froze mid-stride. The koi fish hung limp in Zhao's hand, its glow extinguished. Silence devoured the world. Zhao turned to Aang slowly, eyes reflecting the last dying spark of Tui's light. "Balance," Zhao said, "is overrated." Aang dropped to his knees, not because of defeat, because of something far worse. He could no longer feel the moon. He could no longer feel half the world. The Avatar spirit staggered inside him, its own rhythm broken. Katara sobbed. Her bending faltered, water slipping from her grip as though abandoned. Zhao smiled triumphantly at the chaos he'd unleashed. Aang lifted his head, and something ancient inside him whispered, "Get up." He rose slowly, not with the energy of a child, not with the terror of a boy outmatched, but with the fury of a spirit whose world had just been shattered. His tattoos began to glow. The water trembled beneath his feet. The air thickened with power. Zhao's smile faltered. "You should not have done that," Aang said softly. The oasis pulsed. The Avatar was awakening. The moment the moon's light vanished from the sky, the world seemed to exhale, a long, hollow breath that drained color from every corner of the oasis. Shadows deepened. The air grew colder. Even the fire in Zhao's torches flickered uncertainly, as though unsure of its own allegiance. And at the center of it all stood Aang, still, silent, glowing. The blue light flowing beneath his skin pulsed like a second heartbeat, rising and falling in steady waves. His arrow tattoos ignited in a soft white radiance, illuminating the cavern walls. The water beneath his feet began to ripple outward, forming concentric rings. Zhao stumbled back a step, tightening his grip on Tui's limp form. "No," he whispered. This is not possible." Aang didn't blink, didn't breathe. "When you hurt the world," Aang said, voice low and echoing with something otherworldly, "you hurt me." Katara looked up from the ground, face streaked with tears. But he couldn't hear her anymore. Not fully. Not with the Avatar spirit surging through him like a roaring river. Every sensation was filtered through something larger, deeper. Pain, rage, sorrow, duty. Gyatso's voice reached him faintly, barely a whisper against the growing storm. "Aang, be careful." But care had left the world the moment Zhao plunged his hand into sacred water. Aang rose into the air, not jumped, with airbending. He rose, lifted by unseen currents that wrapped around him like spirit hands. His glider lay forgotten on the ice below. The water beneath him spiraled upward, forming a halo of shimmering droplets. Zhao's bravado crumbled. Aang raised one hand. The water obeyed instantly. No bending forms, no physical motion. The world simply bent because the Avatar asked it to. A massive wave surged upward, towering over Zhao like a living wall of fury. He stumbled backward, slipping on the ice. "No! No! Soldiers! To me, protect your admiral!" But no one moved. Half the soldiers had already fled toward the tunnels. The others stood frozen in terror, watching the water twist into a spiraling vortex behind Aang, an unnatural storm in miniature. Aang pointed. The wave crashed. Zhao was thrown backwards with bone-rattling force, smashing into the sacred rock wall. His armor cracked. The golden talisman clattered from his grip and skidded across the ice. "No!" Zhao lunged for it. Aang snapped his fingers. The ice around the talisman shattered, pushing it out of Zhao's reach. Aang floated down, landing lightly on the now dark water. He extended a hand toward the limp moon spirit, still trapped in Zhao's fist. "Tui," Aang whispered, "come home." The koi fish glowed faintly in response, a hopeful flicker. Zhao snarled and clutched it closer. "You think I will let you undo what I've done?" He thrust his other palm forward, summoning a wild plume of fire. Aang didn't dodge. He inhaled. The flames simply folded, drawn into the vortex of energy spiraling around his body. Zhao's attack vanished like a candle crushed in a fist. Zhao stumbled again, face whitening. "What are you?" Aang stepped forward, eyes glowing white. "I am the bridge," he said softly, "between what should be and what must never be." Zhao backed against the cavern wall, panic rising like bile. He had wanted to face the Avatar. He had dreamed of it, but he had not dreamed of this, the Avatar standing over him as though he were already a footnote in someone else's history. Katara watched, trembling, torn between awe and fear. Sokka gripped his boomerang, unsure whether to intervene or pray. Gyatso alone stepped forward. "Aang," he said carefully, "remember who you are." Aang hesitated. For a moment, his eyes flickered, white giving way to gray-blue, human again. Zhao saw his chance. He lunged with the koi fish, raising it high as though to smash it against the rocks. Aang moved without thinking. The water beneath him surged upward, forming a massive tendril that wrapped around Zhao's arm and held it suspended in midair. The Admiral screamed as his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, but Aang did not tighten his grip. He only held him, frozen in place. Then, with a soft exhale, Aang summoned the water higher, gentler than before, and cradled the moon spirit in a floating sphere. The fish drifted away from Zhao's hand, limp but whole. Aang bowed his head. The water lowered Tui back into the oasis. The instant the koi fish touched the water, a brilliant light exploded outward. The cavern walls glowed. The air warmed. Katara gasped as her bending returned in a burst of clarity, and above them, the moon reappeared, blazing silver in the night sky. Balance restored. But Zhao stumbled backward, eyes wide. No, this is impossible. You cannot." He didn't see the dark tendril of water rising behind him until it was too late. La had awakened. The ocean spirit's wrath exploded upward in a geyser of spiraling water, taking the form of a great serpentine beast. It towered over Zhao, its glowing mass swirling with barely contained fury. Zhao screamed. The spirit lunged. Aang moved. He leapt between them, arms raised. "Stop!" His voice rang through the cavern like a gong. "There has been enough destruction." The ocean spirit froze, its massive form quivering mere inches from Zhao's terrified face. Aang turned, eyes softening. He has taken enough life. Don't take his. The water trembled. Gyatso stepped forward, breath still shaky. Aang, he said softly, the spirits do not forgive easily. Aang lowered his arms. Then let me be the first one who does. The cavern was silent for several long seconds. Finally, slowly, La withdrew, the massive water serpent deflating like mist under moonlight. The water splashed back into the oasis, rippling outward as though exhaling. Zhao collapsed to the ice, shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at Aang, hatred and fear warring in his eyes. "You should have let it kill me," he spat. Aang looked at him, exhausted. "No." Zhao pushed himself to his knees, still trembling. "I will not stop. I will never stop hunting you. Never." Aang turned away, sorrow heavy in his bones. "Then that is the burden you carry, not me." Guards seized Zhao cautiously, dragging him toward the tunnels. His curses faded into the dark. Katara rushed to Aang, catching him just as his knees buckled. "Aang? Aang, are you okay?" He shook his head faintly. I don't know." Gyatso placed a steadying hand on his back. "You restored balance today, Aang." Aang closed his eyes. But at what cost? They stayed by the oasis until dawn. The moon glowed strongly once again above the world, healing the wounds Zhao tried to carve into the sky. The spirits quieted. Peace, fragile, trembling, returned. Later, back in the snowy courtyard of the Northern Water Tribe, Aang gazed up at the horizon. War still raged beyond these ice walls. Zhao was alive. Ozai would not stop. Azula was rising. And Aang? Aang no longer felt like a child escaping a destiny placed on him. He felt like a guardian finally opening his eyes. Katara stepped beside him, brushing snow from her gloves. "We're with you," she said softly. Sokka slung an arm around his shoulder. "All the way!" Gyatso rested a hand on his other shoulder. "The world begins again, little lion." Aang smiled faintly. The wind picked up, swirling gently around his feet. He opened his glider. "Then let's begin again with it." And as he soared into the early morning light, past ice walls, past ocean tides, past fear itself, the Avatar flew toward a future still clouded with war, but brighter than the night before.